Hello, and welcome to Wavicle, the podcast that reflects on the process of being part of Social Action Inquiry Scotland. We delve into what has emerged for us during this process of being part of the inquiry. We highlight our learnings and unlearnings, and we explore the topics that have been rooted within us. I'm Amanda, and today on the podcast, Laurie is joining us to lead two conversations about prefigurative social action. And these conversations revolve around the two residentials the inquiry team and some of our allies were part of. The first half of this conversation involves Laurie, Chris, and Catherine-Rose, or CR for short, and they delve into the concept of being prefigurative and learning and unlearning from our ancestry. This part of the conversation really taps into a reflection that Chris had about how do we find within the past the stories that help us to create the future that we want. We invite you to reflect along the way with us, and I offer some questions to ponder at the end of the episode. Now let's get into the conversation.
Maybe we could start with that a little bit, Chris or Sia. What's the difference between Prefigurative Social Action Inquiry and Social Action Inquiry Scotland?
I almost wonder if we want to define what prefigurative, because I suppose I would say that for me, the language of prefigurative is slippery somehow. It slips out of my understanding, and I often need to re-anchor into what that even is for us. Yeah, Chris, I don't know, maybe you and I could reacquaint ourselves with that term.
I guess I have two things that anchor me in what prefigurative action is, because it's a kind of like, it's not a great term. People always say, what the hell does that mean? And it's not common parlance, and it's not, it feels a bit academic. The things that root me are Gandhi, that's saying we should be the change we wish to see in the world. So for me, it's about action that embodies the future that you want to see in the world, being the future now. And the other that kind of really anchored it for me in my life as an activist, I guess, was during the Occupy movement. So just kind of watching Occupy from afar felt like one of the first movements that was trying to do social change differently and definitely kind of non-violently. But then there was this guy in Occupy on the West Coast whose name was Pancho Ramos Steele. And he was a Mexican who'd come into America from Mexico and kind of overstayed. So he was an undocumented immigrant. And he was part of the Occupy movement on the West Coast. He used to say that for every 10 actions that he did in the world, 1 was an action of protest and 9 were actions of creating the future he wanted to see. So his actions of protest, which were the things that got him kind of his cult status, were his act of non-violence was to sit in awkward places and meditate until the police kind of physically had to lift him up and remove him. And that was his act of protest. And then his other 9 acts were to create urban food growing projects in underserved neighborhoods of LA. What is it that makes that prefigurative? And I think if it was not prefigurative and you were worried about people's food and their food security, you'd open a food bank. For it to be prefigurative, you're kind of setting up food growing projects where people can grow their own food. They have their own sovereignty, they have their own control, and they can create healthy foods. They create community through growing together. And that's kind of what makes it prefigurative. Yeah, so Gandhi and Pancho were my kind of reference points.
I can definitely riff off of that. I think for me, there's something about time. So when we began the work on the Social Action Inquiry Scotland, Sam Anderson, the other co-chair alongside me, we talked about time and what time would mean for this work, because the work is just under 3 years. That was the kind of container that was offered to us when we stepped into the role. So there were some things that were sort of fixed in terms of the work, so the time, the financial resource, that there would be 2 co-chairs, for example. And we started to ask questions about time because we knew that an understanding of what social action looks like in Scotland is so vast, that actually there's so much of that happening right now. And it's a place, like many places, that has had this long history of social activism and social change and resistance. So how could we come to grips with the immenseness of that story without thinking in terms of a different way of thinking about time? So time, yes, being linear, the days rolling on to the next, and, the minutes rolling into the hours, and all of that kind of forward motion, but then time being something more like a spiral that is kind of not linear maybe, but vertical, that goes up and down, that's very deep, so that the change that might happen within one person cycles through into generations that they don't yet know, or comes from generations behind that they're not physically connected to. And that was a way for us kind of honoring that, yes, we had this period of time of just under 3 years to do this work, but that it's connected to any number of other social justice movements within Scotland and other kinds of inquiries and questions, and that we would be adding something which someone else would pick up after us. So for me, there's something about prefigurative, which helps us step into that vertical line of time so that we can start to see ourselves as being an echo of a conversation, and that we add our voice, hopefully in some kind of harmony, and that continues on this arc of change, or this spiral of change. That's for me what it offers. But I suppose to speak personally about my own experience of that, I think for me as a queer person, there's something that's been very important to me and very beautiful about imagining. The role of imagination within queer movements has been to imagine ourselves into the future, and a future that maybe is denied, can be denied through legislation, through quite, obvious acts of violence. There can be a denial of that future for many people. It's just my experience as a queer person that I've had to think of that, that part of coming out is imagining yourself into a reality that makes space for you. And then you spend your life still coming out again and again and again. And that's all about this kind of making space. But there's something so creative in it. It's really powerful, that creative energy. So yeah, I love what you said, Chris, about that. One act is an act of protest, and 9 acts out of the 10 are an act of creativity. And I think that's part of that spiral. That's what creative energy does. It moves us in a different way.
One thing that came up for me was from Debbie and Callum's conversation about also the self-doubt that can happen when you're in these spaces, when you're playing, when you're imagining things, when you're going into your own personal history. There's a sense that some people might think this is selfish, that you're about society, you're about social change. Why are you having a residential and talking about your feelings, to put it disruptively? There's a balance and there's a tension there that's important to hold, and I'm wondering if that triggers anything for both of you.
I have an answer to that question, why would we be having a residential, but I also just want to pause and just acknowledge that doubt that people have and where that might be coming from and what that's about. So I don't want to kind of gloss over that. But then in terms of the answer, why would we do it? Well, because, there are 2 reasons for me. One is because we are agents of change, and therefore we're a kind of a tool. We will be more effective if we're sharpened. So yeah, we need to spend lots of time on ourselves. That is time well spent. And the other is that what I find in these gatherings is that they are always, for me, as in some way a microcosm of what's going on in the world. They're always a barometer of where is humanity at the minute. And so it's useful for us as activists to see what's going on. We can look at the dynamics in the group and we can learn from that about what's going on in the world. What things might work, what things might break us out of these cycles, what things might help us find imagination enough to envisage the future. That's why I'm there. I'm watching and learning about where are we, what might be a next step.
I think there's something maybe for me around watching to see what is going to help us break these cycles is really helpful. The idea that understanding our experience is somehow counterproductive to the movement and the change that we're trying to create. I think that is a necessary element, because otherwise I think we create, rather than digesting trauma and pain, we recreate those power structures in another system. And we can see that now. We can look at that, the kind of arc of history, and particularly recently, I think the conversations around Black Lives Matter, for example, is really helping us to understand, or say Indigenous land claims and land rights in Canada, where I'm from. There's a kind of history of people who left a place, like my own lineage of people who left Scotland as part of Highland clearances, massive power struggle over land, disenfranchised people coming to another place and repeating that pattern. It's shocking to see that someone who had their land removed for them arrived somewhere else and took the land that was there, that didn't have the same kind of formal ownership structures to it, but there was a sense of belonging, and then a displacement of Indigenous people. So my family, and that the landing in Nova Scotia of my Scottish ancestors, that's our story. And then it's my job now, where I am, to unlearn that and not repeat those patterns, and to reconcile that and to come into some sort of alignment with that story. Because I don't think I can be in the space of holding power where I do hold power if I haven't done that work. So for me, there's something about that. The whole history piece that we did, that first residential, helps to come into contact with those stories that really are denied, right? Like that is a story that I am having to unpick. It's not written down in a kind of family story somewhere. I'm having to unlearn that and learn it at the same time. And then I think coming to the body and the present, for me to be, yes, there's a sense of self-doubt. There's also can be a sense of fear, honestly, like as a queer person, kind of feminine identified, coming into a space with others who are not necessarily queer, who are not necessarily immigrants, who might not be feminine identified. There's a lot of power dynamics there. And then there's also power dynamics between us in different ways, different kinds of migrant identities, different ethnicities, different class histories, different kinds of education histories. Like all of that power is playing out in the room. And to come into a space of acceptance of some of those differences and also to come into creative energy together to make something together with those differences being present, not denied, that for me is a powerful act. So I suppose it really depends when people talk about residentials and the kind of work. I think in this case, we are going deeply enough to come to grips with some of the kind of power structures that we see all over the place, but we don't have the same opportunities to intervene in. And they're playing out for us constantly. This is a moment just for 2 days where we get to say, what can we do to disrupt this? So we can take that disruptive energy into those other spaces. That's what it's offering. So it's giving something out the way.
I think I also really connected with that sense of responsibility in some way, or sense of a call, whether it's a call of my ancestors to honor them or to understand and confront them, or whether it's the call of future generations that I will have to be unlearned. Quite a provocative question, I think, that was put to us. There are a lot of questions that were still live from that, like, as you were saying, like tapping into that microcosm and tapping into that energy and thinking, where can I bring it? And I think I'm still struggling with that and thinking, where does this find a place in a world that isn't prefigurative? I'm wondering how that's been for you as well, finding a place for that energy in your life outside of the prefigurative social action inquiry.
Yeah, it's a great question. How do we bring it? If the promise of that work is that we can bring that energy out, how do we do that? I can think of kind of two ways that it's happening. So one, because the prefigurative work, this kind of imaginative space, which is 2 residentials at the moment, and there'll be a third, happens within the inquiry, the social action inquiry for Scotland timeline, which is this 3-year timeline. And I think for us, there was some important and quite difficult reconciling that we were doing between that first prefigurative residential and the second. And one was that, to take Chris's point, that, even when we sometimes try to create something new, some of those power dynamics can play back in. And we were experiencing that in the inquiry, that we had tried to create something new in Scotland around the way that we would support other communities who were doing social action, and how we would offer resources of different kinds to those communities to help them tell their story. And what we were noticing is that some of the same power dynamics around who is comfortable accessing resources and accessing space of resource or feeling entitled to resource. Some of that was starting to play out again in some small ways, but we were surprised. We thought that by creating something new, now looking back, it seems odd to think that power dynamics wouldn't play through, but they did, because these are systemic. So anytime we're still working within the system that we're operating in, even when we're trying to do that stuff like Chris was referring to about the, food growing networks rather than food banks. It's the same metaphor we've had with the inquiry right from the beginning about who's working to create a world where we don't need food banks, and how can our work as a Social Action Inquiry Scotland support that future space. But I think we need to reckon with the reality that the future is carrying the past with it. There is never going to be a blank slate. And it's unhelpful, I think, to think that there will be, that actually the process of unlearning that language that we've been using today is needed. So for me, coming into our residentials helps me to reckon with it. It helps me to step out slightly of the day-to-day work in Scotland to ask some bigger questions. And it also helps me reconnect with the dreaming space, because really it's so hard. I don't know why it's so hard. But to create waking dreaming space where I can imagine, really imagine the work and the purpose of the work that I'm doing. It's very difficult to protect that. It's quite a fragile space. So it needs the nourishment of time away. It needs the nourishment of, nature. It needs the nourishment physically of food and being together with other people. It needs tending to.
For me, how am I taking this energy forward? I think my sphere of action is becoming gradually smaller and smaller and smaller. I'm not trying to change the world anymore from this sense of social action being about changing the world, because all I think I can do with any skill is change the bits of the world that I touch. So the land that I live on, the people who I have relationships with, my own mind and body, and work on that with no expectation that that will have any real impact in the world. I mean, maybe it will, but it's the only thing that can for me. How to tend to a piece of land, I've been learning over 4 years. I understand now in ways that I didn't before. My own mindset, my own, what am I decolonizing about myself? What do I need to unlearn? That goes really deep. When you're trying to grow food on a piece of land, it's not about extraction. It's not about ownership. It's not about possession. It's about relationship. Unlearning all the things that I've learned in my life about race and gender and identity and what it means to be a man. How do I decolonize my masculinity? What are my relationships like with my family? What are my relationships like with the people I work with the people I live with? Those feel like the things that I can work on that will have a real impact.
I was just going to pick up that point, Chris, because I think that's where change happens. I think it happens in our spheres, and maybe it radiates out, but for it to be authentic change, it has to come, I think, from that alignment. So whenever I was 16 and first started to read feminist thinking and the personal is political, it's true. And those two things come together in what you're describing for me.
We now jump into the second half of the conversation, which involves Laurie, Deborah, and Callum. And they cover the aspects of what questions and feelings do you have when you're stepping into a residential about prefigurative social action? And what are the challenges of bringing what you imagine in these spaces into the present and into the future?
It's quite a lot to come into a 2-day residential with people that you don't know, and you don't know, is this going to be a safe space for all of us? And I was, in the end, really felt so grateful that I feel like I could share a lot of myself and see that was reflected in other people from different lenses. Yeah, so I'm curious because I honestly don't know anything about where the second residential went, what directions it took, and maybe you could talk me through like what differences it had for you, Debbie, and maybe for you, Callum, like It's different from other things that you have experienced before or similar in other ways too.
I think for me, I guess kind of I came into it not knowing what was going to happen. It's quite unusual. I feel like usually I have a bit of context before. There are lots of things that are kind of similar. A lot of the work that we do, we talk about kind of working in emergence, the third horizon, kind of future visioning, which is kind of like another way of saying prefigurative. And like it's all about kind of imagination and what can be and what seeds you can sow to create that new world and create that change. So I think in terms of that, a lot of the content felt familiar, but I think it was more kind of the space that was held and the kind of connections that were built and the delivery that was very different. I think for me, it was like challenging myself quite a lot to really kind of go into the space, even when it felt quite different. Like we did some exercises around kind of like body and energy. And for me, that's the first time I'd done anything like that. And at the start, I was kind of like, I'm not sure where this is going to lead. And it was interesting to see where it did lead. I think there was a little bit of tension that I came into the space with that I was kind of holding that maybe I didn't articulate. What regions of Scotland weren't represented there and different voices within Scotland weren't. That was a bit different from my current work because whenever we're doing convenings, it's like who's in the space and why. And I feel like sometimes I guess I didn't know why I was in the space and I kept on questioning that. What am I brought here to do? I don't know what my role is. And that was kind of sometimes a bit difficult for me, I think. But I really valued kind of how the space was held as well and how we held like a lot of those tensions.
Yeah, I can see how that would feel, especially without any context, thinking, why are we here in this particular place? What are we here to do? Why am I here? What's the purpose here? Especially when you're doing practices that are maybe less familiar, like these kind of body practices and similar things. How was that for you, Debbie? Did similar things come up?
Yeah, very, very similar. It was also different for me this time because I was actually living in the residential as opposed to the last time where I was coming in and going out, because of childcare. So I couldn't live in the residential. And so the connection, though, was a full connection, but there was a little bit of emptiness because, like what happens after 5 o'clock and what happens in a little Nordic space that we create around the fire, where we kind of talk about more personal things and, all the stories coming in. I mean, which we do throughout the day, but there is a little less tension sitting with us as we kind of have blankets and, have the fire in the middle. And, it's such a beautiful space to be in. That contact itself provided a different framework for my mind. There was a very physical connection because I think last time it was more of if you're talking about the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it was a different needs were met. So there was a like emotional need which was met, and there was a kind of a intellectual need met. But this time there was a very physical need with the energy work that came out, where we reached out to people and then we sent energies from one to the other, where we felt like someone was cool and someone was warmer, and then we could send energies. That sent two things. One, what as Callum was saying, like what is happening, how do I fit in this, so a lot of questions, but then all those questions invited in and then held well so that you are able to lessen your anxieties, as you come in. So more embodied experience of things as opposed to last time. But in addition to that, another thing which I felt last time and this time is it's a privilege, of being part of this experience. I know in my other workspaces isn't welcomed, it's like, what is this here doing? Sometimes in inverted commas, wasting time with these exercises, but how strengthening and how long lasting the impact is. I can go for a workshop in an academic space and then forget everything the next day and move on with business as usual stuff. But this continues to stay with you. Even today, I can feel that embodied experience because actually you have used your different senses to get into that space and be with each other. And it's very powerful and lasting in many ways.
What kind of things were you asking yourselves, discussing? What possibilities and challenges did you confront?
I remember very clearly starting with this point. Callum, you may remember, like, what are we missing? And then we had a little role playing with Nick and Chris. And, they were like, oh, I feel like we're not reaching somewhere in the mountains. I can see some fire there. And, like, just thinking of social action being neglected somewhere. How can we cast the net wider or things on those lines? So we did something very visual. And so we were thinking of communities, we're thinking of geography, we're thinking of different connections that we may have missed, or we need to kind of think about, both for the inquiry as in social action inquiry, but also in prefigurative thinking. What do we often miss? Who do we often miss? Which are the, where is a calling in many ways? And there was a little chat around that calling, and we were trying to kind of see the calling in an embodied way and through energy work. So we tried to think of a lot of areas where we felt we are pulled towards or drawn towards at the moment, reaching out where voices may not have been amplified or voices may have been silenced, or things like that. Not saying that social action doesn't exist there. We need to reach out so that there is more solidarity and more shared understanding there. I guess I'm also thinking about it in line with social action inquiries work right now, as we were thinking of what's missing. I mean, because inquiry has a deadline of December 2023. And so I think we began with that question of what's missing, who is missing in terms of issues, but also people and communities. So that was something which we covered quite in detail on the first day, at least.
I remember that exercise really well. And I remember kind of after the body work, we moved in kind of exploring the relationship between social action, inquiry in Scotland through body work. I remember there being like familiarity between some of the words, but then like also tension. I feel like social action and Scotland felt quite connected to one another, but the inquiry kind of, there was a little bit more distance, like in terms of energy and how the words relate with one another, which I think stood out to me. And I remember that geography point really kind of like came up really visually when we were doing kind of the body work with the words. I think it's really hard as well because the way we ended the space was very visual. Like I remember we were all just like drawing on the floor. What does the inquiry look like to us? Like what does the social action in Scotland look like to us? Everyone's take on it was so different, and I think it's quite hard to put words around kind of like what was created in the visuals, but it felt very like dynamic.
And like the last time, Laurie, it was so different, but when it came together, it looked in sync. It just looked like everything was speaking to the other, also speaking to the connections that may exist in the fabric of society, like who we are before we kind of have all these masks and dressings on. We are basically people who have values under us and who are looking to be joined by the values, of kindness, love, care, rather than the mask that we have as a society. This is my interpretation of it right now. Connection from last time where we did a lot of visuals around understanding social action and what's missing, and we brought those connections together, and then they didn't make sense in individually. People had to think, but when they came in together, we could see there is a heart and there are hands, and you could see different things. For me, is basically that social action in general, it syncs so well when we come together, but people with shared understanding, because under our mask we are all the same people who want to live by values. And I think if we kind of look for prefigurative social action through the lens of value systems and relational work, I think we'll have a shared future together. And, also gives us a lot of hope, but gives us a lot of these values which are innate and innate to humans, which, as I mentioned, are of love and kindness and care.
Yeah, over such an intimate space, so you really develop an openness and sensitivity, a kind of mutual interconnectedness, which feels important. How does that relate to social action?
That's one of the challenges for me, actually, to transfer that work to what I'm doing, because here are a group of people who are quite connected in terms of their experience of pain and in different, in terms of identities and various things, but there is a connection. And also we've spent that time, quite expansive time together, to work on a shared feeling, but we don't have that privilege and luxury when we go to social action happening. But we also operate in a space where there are a lot of people who are activists, who are not into a space where we can say, oh, relax, let's do some energy work, let's do some body work. They were like, we don't have the time because crisis, it's like we just need to kind of get on. And that for me is the biggest challenge, how to actually cross. And that's something maybe we can talk about. I mean, how do we balance out and reach out to people who are activists and to people who are action based and see body work and energy and, feelings as something which is like, sometimes they say, oh, it's kind of waste of time. And we want to do things differently and emergently. And people like plans. People like having a Gantt chart. People like seeing what is the next thing. People like clarity. And this is something which I struggle with. Relational work is really difficult. it's easier to work with 10 people who have similar, like for the 5 of us, we find a lot of connections. But when we go out to the communities that we work with, the communities are really stressed because of resources and various things. So it's like there was the saying, like, what does democracy mean to a hungry person? Like it's the same thing. Like, so what would this body work mean to someone who needs something else, needs to be attended to on a kind of a timely basis? So how do we kind of have this?
Yeah, a really interesting reflection there, 'cause I actually think in the London organising and activism space, healing and body work is quite at the forefront at the moment. I think it depends what kind of activist and campaigning spaces you're in, especially in kind of racial justice spaces. I don't know if you've ever heard of Healing Justice London, but they're like a massive anchor organisation within kind of a lot of the racial justice kind of community within London. And a lot of their work's like body work and centering healing. So I think it's interesting to hear kind of in Scotland where there's that tension between kind of activists, because I think in the spaces that I'm in, it's the opposite. Kind of activists and organisers are the ones bringing that, and the sector's rejecting it, and it's just not being resourced. I think as well, I really hear kind of that struggle of how do you do deep relational work and adjust to everyone whilst also recognizing that there needs to be like sometimes like collective processes and practices. And I guess it goes into how do you connect the theory and the feeling and the social work with the action? Because like the feelings is the social bit, but then like to get to the action, there needs to be some form of kind of process and like actually just getting on with the work. And yeah, I hear that and I feel that tension in like my own work as well.
Yeah, I think that tension stayed with me as well from my experience of reflection and action. It's good to just, even if the tension can't be resolved, just to stay in the tension, I guess. Stay with reflection and action, pulling on each other. And people need money, people need resources, people need physical, substantial things, but then there's also the important, intangible, and visible relationship work as well that is necessary, but it's, maybe less visible.
Thanks for sharing that, Callum. I'll just have a look. To your point, Laurie, I had a chat about this challenge or this kind of this paradox that I feel sometimes in the relational work that we do and, in body and energy work that we do and thinking about prefigurative and not having a sense of outputs and the paradox of outcomes and process and, all these things. And then I had a chat with Sam, and sometimes we just think of outcomes as what is coming out of a story. But Sam brought this interesting point in to my mind, which I'm really reflecting on properly in the last couple of weeks. The process as an outcome is also important to be shared because it's never been tested before. And thinking of the process and what we're going through, and as you were saying, reflecting and staying with it. We often have this thing like staying with the trouble, that kind of thing, staying with the messiness, but also reflecting on that as how important that is to show an alternative way of doing things. But whether it's going to have impact or not, it's important for the process to continue. And the process is an important learning at the moment because it's not done before. And, relational work, everyone thinks is difficult. We've had so many examples of that in the last couple of weeks that we are organizing things and working with the community. But staying with the trouble and thinking of the process as an important bit of that story, which is emerging at the end, is something which Sam introduced. And I'm kind of trying to work on it. It is not made to make sense, but just staying with it and trusting the process. If you're talking about values and things, yeah.
And to round up these conversations, I would like to offer this reflection that came from Chris. He says, "There are forces around the land, around the sun and the seasons, and they influence us. There is a sense of energies moving in the world, energies that we don't quite understand, and energies are moving across the universe. These are the waves of change. It's created the evolution that brought us to where we are now. And that is where I get my hope about the future. It's that long sense of time, of the universe expanding, and not knowing exactly why, but it is. So there's an openness, a possibility ahead, the waves of change, and it will go on to ripple through our ancestors. It will keep going and going. So the future isn't a static place that we will get to. For me, there's a sense of moving in the right direction at some level." Thank you for joining us. I have 2 questions that you can ponder on in your own self-reflective time. And these are: what spheres of influence or spheres of change can you tap into in your life? And the second question is, how can you make time to document and tune into the process as well as creating the desired outcome? Thank you again for joining us on the Wavicle podcast. Our episodes are released fortnightly, and we can't wait for you to join us for the next one.